Nielsen was all about what they called person-based measurement, right? So you knew who in the house was watching, because you filled out your little diary, and everybody in the house had their own diary or their own automated thing. Whereas with ACR and streaming measurement in general, we're generally measuring the glass of the TV set and not, and less the people in the household. But there are some companies that are working on that. Like, how important is that for Vevo? And what have you seen that you've been like, oh, this is pretty exciting?
Yeah, I mean, I will reference T-Vision again. We've done a lot of work with them to identify who's in the house, who's watching the screen. 74% of our content is actually viewed in one with two or more people. And so, as I mentioned, the study that we did over the course of time to really revealed some amazing metrics. And so I think looking at those alternatives, and then also thinking about, when I hear you guys talk about like, we need a standardization, we need a common lexicon for measurement in general. And I think that because there are so many options, I love the optionality. I think that that is actually crucial. We don't want to go back to a measurement monopoly. However, having those different platforms, data sources coming together to really establish what those best practices are and that common language so that we can have that standardization in the market is going to be really important for our advertisers and for the customer experience as well.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Christina, what are you guys seeing in terms of that? In terms of, again, because you're a publisher, like,
Yeah.
understanding persons versus, TV sets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, my particular world in Estrella is digital. And so there's a lot of different metrics we get there. We really, I think for us, our most important elements are impressions, revenue, and viewership. And within viewership, it's things like minutes, sessions, uniques. And so for us, those are kind of like the key and core metrics that we do across all of our distribution platforms, all of our different layers of touch points with the consumer. And so that's the type of data, kind of to Aaron's point, like those are the two or few main pieces of data that we want to get back so we can understand like how we're performing in terms of like our each distribution platform, what's the ROI associated with it. And so for us, that's very important from like a supply standpoint. And then from like, a buyer standpoint, I think in terms of data, I actually think this has to do with like, I think the world is moving into more programmatic. It's existed for a long time, obviously, but, I think that, we've seen a transition of more programmatic, more things like PMPs come up into the space. And with that comes we all have to be much more diligent about the metadata that's getting passed to the buyers and making sure these buyers understand what is this metadata. And this is a continuation of what we talked about before. There's no one standardization for some of these metrics that are getting passed through. So genre, for example, we're a Spanish language company. When we first started out, we had all of our genres in Spanish, but the buy side buys in English. And so it's, I mean, that's just one very easy example of how there's a disconnect between the buy side and the sell side. But I do think money is where things are going to go towards, right? Like money has always been the driver of most things. So if we want to have some sort of standardization, I feel that it's the buy side that's going to really start to build out something to make it more standardized.
Gotcha. And are you finding that metadata is just because I know that's been a problem in TV for a long time, that when they digitized all the shows, they didn't really put any metadata on them. It was just like Seinfeld comedy, Friends, season 3, episode 2, and that was that. So you finding that you now have more metadata, against for both the ads and also for the content.
Oh, sure. I mean, from us, like we built out our content management system to make sure we pass through essential content signals, so to speak, to make sure that our buy side at the end of the day gets those different content signals. Could be things like genre, rating, language, the most simple things. And these are things that never got passed previously. And so programmatic buyers are starting to realize like, oh, I only want these certain genres or these certain like ratings. And so that way, if we're able to pass it from like the source input, pass it through, hopefully that these guys who are on the buy side will be able to buy our inventory more optimally than previously. I think another thing too is that there is an element of, like I mentioned, standardization. Right now we have our own publisher content signals, and we have no idea whether these are really standardized. And so I think that's the trouble here, is that we might be passing all these signals, but the buy side might not recognize them because that's not in their standard set of genres or ratings. And the last piece I want to mention is that content IDs, Julie mentioned this before, or someone mentioned before, cherry picking is a big issue sometimes. I mean, we do like, the DNC, for example, that's great. We need to make sure that some of these live events, like we want to be able to capture that excess demand, but then also we don't want them to necessarily cherry pick everything, because we also have really great content across our platforms. We don't want them to miss out on reaching some of these audiences, because it's very clear our a certain audience, and you can get that on many other of the other content that we produce and distribute, not just on those like particular highlighted events and featured events.